Hello, everyone. I'm back. This time it's just me. Um, I'll be going through every card in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Well, all the red cards, excuse me. Talking about it from a limited point of view and also whatever constructed insights I happen to have. Alright, so let's just get started with the commons. We've got Axiom Engraver, which is 1 in a red for a 1/3 creature Phyrexian wizard. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. You can tap and remove an oil counter from it to discard a card and draw a card. So, of course, red gets this like kind of inferior version of the looting effect where you discard first and then draw, but that's still good for, getting rid of lands you don't need, getting rid of situational cards you don't need. Um, of course, you can only do it twice, so this is a little bit limited, but it's also 1/3, which, isn't exactly preferred stats, but against the right sort of start with like 2 1s, 2 2s, 1 1s, you kind of shut all those down. I mean, not completely, but to an extent. Um, I would say this is a fine card. A lot of cards care about oil counters and things. So yeah, I'd say this is at least like a 5. It's decent. Um, but it doesn't really get me excited to like raise it any higher than that, but I'd play it for sure. All right, next we have Barbed Batterfist, which is 1 in a red for an artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin, so it enters attached to a 2/2 Rebel. And it gives +1/-1 and has equip 1. So you play this as a 2 mana 3/1 basically, and later you can move that equipment onto things, which gives +1/-1. So that +1/-1 part is almost nothing. I mean, on the right creature, it slightly raises the power, might slightly speed up your clock against your opponent. So, that's alright. I think really the reason you're playing this is one, because it's a 3/1 for 2, which is good. Pretty much any aggressive deck, just really any deck, because that 3/1 can trade with bigger things on the block. It's higher damage on the attack. So yeah, that's like just better than you'd normally get. And the equipment is sort of a circumstantial benefit because there's sort of equipment synergies that care specifically about having equipments. Yeah, but I'd say this is pretty dang good. Like, for a common, it's nothing crazy. It's mostly just stats. But I'll give it a 6. All right, next we have Blade Graft Aspirant, which is 2 in a red for a 2/3 creature Phyrexian warrior. And it has Menace, and equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Activated abilities of equipment you control that target this cost 1 less to activate. So yeah, I mean, this is an obvious equipment enabler. Piling equipments onto a Menace creature, that can be tough to deal with. If it's big enough, it's likely to trade for 2 things of your opponent. And then, of course, you still have the equipments around to move on to something else. And, obviously this sort of reduces the cost of those spells, reduce the cost of activation, that all of that just sort of gives you a lot of tempo if you're playing a bunch of equipments. So I'd say in the right deck, I mean, this is the kind of enabler you'd want. But I think you're not getting too much out of this if you're just like playing one equipment spell. I mean, maybe. It's a little hard to say. It depends on the equipment. But yeah, I would say it's pretty good in an equipment deck. All right, next we have Blazing Crescendo, which is 1 in a red for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn. Exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Okay, this is interesting. So that buff is pretty meh, just because just the +1 toughness means it's not too easily going to win you a combat. I think the +3 attack makes it more likely you're going to trade the combat, and then the exile draw sort of ensures that you get another card out of this, which is sort of like a 2-for-1. I mean, it would be a 2-for-1 if you actually won the combat with that buff, which is harder to do, like I said. But, even if you just make an unexpected trade, and it's probably a trade up, and get a card out of it, that's a pretty good deal. Like I think just the fact that you get that free draw off of this, like makes it pretty good. Since you can only play it until the end of your next turn, there's always the risk you exile something too expensive for you to play. Um, and that's always a risk. You're gonna sort of be better off if you play this when you already have quite a few lands, or just try to risk it. But you know, I don't know. I'm gonna give it a 5.5 actually. I don't know. It's just sort of not great as a combat trick, and the draw is a little bit inconsistent, but it's decent. All right, next we have Chimney Rabble, which is 3 in a red for a 3/3 creature Phyrexian Goblin Warrior with haste. And when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token. Okay, so stats here, not bad. I mean, you basically get 4/4 of stats for 4 mana, and the 3/3 has haste. So just stats alone, I mean, I think this card is better than you often get at common. I mean, maybe the power level's kind of rising through the years. But yeah, I would say this is pretty good. I mean, you get the 1/1 to potentially sacrifice in a deck that cares about things like that. And yeah, just the overall stats are good. If you're going wide, it gives you 2 creatures. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of reasons to like this. I was going to say 6 or 6.5. We'll just go with 6. I think it's pretty good. All right, so next we have Forge Hammer Centurion, which is 2 in a red for a 3/2 creature Phyrexian Warrior. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on this, and when it attacks, you may remove 2 oil counters from it to make target creature unable to block this turn. So, 3/2 for 3, starting off. That's about a 4, like, baseline, just creature stats. And preventing blocks, that's always very helpful in red decks that are aggressive. Red tends to be on the more aggressive side as well. And oftentimes that's really what you need to just get through and hit that last bit of damage. The problem with aggressive red decks is you're not playing value usually, so you tend to sort of run out of gas. Your opponent plays one good blocker, and then suddenly, they have 5 health left, but there's nothing you can do to push that last 5. So being able to get blockers out of the way, great. Of course, to enable that, you're going to need either some sacrifice, maybe coupled with some proliferate, maybe. And it's not too trivial to even be able to prevent 1 block, but in the right sort of deck, just a deck with lots of sacrifice and little dirtles to sacrifice and things like that. This could be pretty good. I'm going to give it a 6. I think, well, I'm going to go 5.5. It's pretty decent, but takes some work. All right, next we have Free from Flesh, which is a red mana for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Put 2 oil counters on it. So, this is pretty good. I mean, I think this is exactly what you want in like an oil-based aggro deck, for example. +2/+2 for a red mana, that's about what you'd expect. And like that's enough to win a lot of combats pretty well. The 2 oil counters, plenty of creatures in red that want oil counters. They're all over the place. So yeah, like use this on the right creature, gives you quite a bit of value. So I mean, I think this is also sort of in the 6 range. I could even see this being better in certain decks. I don't know. But I approve. Definitely might want one of these in a lot of my decks. All right, next we have Furnace Strider, which is 4 in a red for a 4/5 creature Phyrexian Beast. It enters with 2 oil counters, and you can remove an oil counter to give a creature you control haste until end of turn. Okay, I mean, I think this is good stats. I mean, if it gives itself haste, it's a 4/5 haste for 5, which is pretty aggressive in red. I mean, it's not too small for that 5 mana cost. Haste is a big upside. It's like that's going to be possibly outclassing the board the moment it enters. So, I mean, I think that's got to be pretty good. You can give at least one other creature haste later, which again increases the damage you're dealing. It's perfect for aggro. I think, um, it is 5 mana, and typically you don't prioritize the top of your curve in aggro, but this might be worth it. I'll just give it, again, a 6. Lots of 6s. I don't know why. I'm just so gravitating toward the 6s right now. All right, next we have Hazardous Blast for 3 in a red, which is a sorcery which deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control, and creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. So this is sort of a perfect role filler in an aggressive deck. Like, it doesn't matter how many blockers they have, you just sort of set up your board, and this ends the gridlock. They just can't block for that turn. They probably die immediately, unless they've been doing a good job of removing your threats. But this is the sort of card that like people, I don't know, they don't tend to see it and get excited about it. I feel like I see cards like this tend to go pretty late. But I think it's very important if you're aggro to be able to just ignore their blockers for a turn, because a lot of the time games in draft end with a gridlock. There's just sort of neither player can really do anything, and maybe there's just some flyers beating back and forth to like define sort of the race of the fight. But if you just play one of these, game's over in that situation. So it's tough to give this card a high rating because it's not very useful when you're just getting beat down. I mean, the 1 damage could kill something, could kill a few things, but that's very situational. But I still think this is a good role filler. And, I'm still not sure I would call it like a powerful. It is powerful in a certain way. I'm going to give this a 7 because it's so important to certain strategies, but it's still maybe not something I would, I guess, prioritize. You only really need like 1 or 2 in your deck, and it's only for a certain kind of situation. So, okay, I'm going to give it a 6. Again, okay, 6 is it's all that's on my mind right now. All right, so next we have Hexgold Slash, which is a red. For an instant that deals 2 damage to target creature. If the creature has Toxic, it deals 4 damage to that creature. So yeah, lots of creatures in this format have Toxic. Just incidentally, so many of them do. So this is like 1 mana deal 4 damage to a creature? I mean, sometimes 2, sometimes 4. But yeah, even if it was just 2, I mean, that's a pretty good card. I think this has to be one of the better removal spells at common in red, or best cards in common at red. So I'm going to give it an 8. Really good to have these just to cheaply deal with their threats, gain a bit of tempo, and just make sure they're not hitting you to death. All right, next we have Kuldotha Cackler, which is 2 in a red for a 2/3 creature Phyrexian hyena with trample. When it attacks, it gets +X+O until end of turn, where X is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. So, obviously, this is meant to be in sort of a more oil-based deck. It doesn't have oil itself, so unless you have some help, it's just attacking as a 2/3 trample, which is pretty bad. If you have 2 oily creatures out, maybe even just 1. I mean, it's attacking as a pretty respectable 3/3 or 4/3 with trample. So that makes it better. I'm still just going to say this is like a 5. You need some help just turn on, and turning it on really just means you're attacking with an okay creature. So it's a 5. Okay, next we have Molten Rebuke, which is 4 in a red for a sorcery, and you can choose 1 or both. Molten Rebuke deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or destroy target equipment. Okay, this is interesting. So equipments are a sub-theme in this format, and if you're able to kill a creature with that 5 damage and destroy an equipment, this is a 2-for-1. So that is pretty nice. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are going to have their sort of random equipments. There's, several colors have equipments, mostly white and red. So a lot of the time, that's not really going to be a thing. In a lot of matchups, you're just going to deal 5 damage to a creature, which is still fine. I mean, you're probably trading about sideways with that. 5 mana for 5 damage, you're probably killing about a 5 drop or a 6 drop or something. Um, which is fine. I mean, you do want some removal like that in limited. And the potential for 2 for 1, I think that kind of moves it up a little bit of a notch. It's still nothing too efficient though, so I'll just give that a 6. Okay, so next we have Sawblade Scamp, which is a red mana for a 1/1 creature Phyrexian Beast with haste. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and you can tap to remove an oil counter from it to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So this is very sort of small and insignificant. 1/1 haste on turn 1, you can hit them, probably, if you're on the play. Okay, and then in the late game, it just slowly pings them. And if you do have a lot of non-creature spells, it could add up to quite a bit of damage. So I would only really play this, though, if I was mega aggro. I mean, it doesn't deal with creatures. It's teeny tiny. It's not going to trade well in combat. It's really just all about dealing that damage to your opponent's face as soon as possible. Which, yeah, I mean, that's always been a strategy in Red. It can work well. So, it's a little hard to say, like, how good that would be in this format. But I'm tempted to say it's not that good. I just, it's not too bad sometimes limited just to skip right from the 1 drop to the 2 drop, just to make sure that each of your cards sort of has that much more impact. Because you ultimately want to gain control of the board, and this doesn't really help you do that. In a really aggressive deck, though, you could play this. I think you could be happy with it. It's just, I'm not the biggest fan. Alright, next we have Shrapnel Slinger, which is 1 in a red for a 2/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature, and when you do, destroy target artifact and opponent controls. I love this card. I think this is super good. Right away, I'm going to say it's like an 8. There's so many artifacts in this format. I mean, it's basically partly an artifact format. And 2/2 for 2, all right, that's stats that fit into your curve. If you don't really want to destroy an artifact, you just play it. But if you do want to destroy an artifact, just sacrifice a mite, sacrifice a goblin, and you just get to destroy an artifact. So, like, that's just a really good sort of gravy ability. And I would always play, like, basically as many of these as I can, unless I really just don't have the creatures to sacrifice. But there's lots of ways to make little tokens to sacrifice, so it should be doable. And yeah, I think just destroying artifacts is going to be a big deal in this format, so I'm going to give that an 8. Alright, next we have Thrill of Possibility, reprinted for who knows how many times at this point. It's 1 in a red for an instant, and as an additional cost to cast the spell, discard a card, and you draw 2 cards. So, classic. I mean, red doesn't get direct card advantage, and this isn't it. This is just a 2 for 2, you could say. But it improves your card quality. A lot of the time you'll have lands you don't care about, situational spells you don't care about. And this just helps you get to the good stuff. It's never bad to play these in your deck. You could even like hold up some sort of response, do this at the end of the turn if, nothing comes up to use that for. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like much, but it's just kind of the card that could go in any deck, really. I'll give it a 5.5. Alright, so next we have Bolt Charge, which is 2 in a red for an instant, and it deals 3 damage to any target. Proliferate. Okay, so typically the kind of burn we get at common in red is like either 2 mana, 3 damage, instant with like not much else going on, or like 3 mana, deal 3 damage with something extra. And this is that, proliferate, probably putting oil counters on, but maybe toxic counters, although red doesn't seem to be a very toxic color. Well, some players beg to differ. But anyways, um, yeah, I mean, I think this is good. Just being able to say, 3 damage to that target right now. Spot removal, super important and limited. You deal with the threats that are giving you the most trouble. And that free proliferate on top of everything, I mean, I think you're always going to want this. It's great. So I'm going to give it a 7.5. All right, next we have Volshock Splitter, which is 3 in a red for an artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. And it gives the equipped creature +2/+0. So it's entering as a 4/2. And it has equip 2 in a red. Okay, so kind of expensive equipment, expensive equip, but that 4/2 for 4. And while, those stats are not great, trades with much cheaper things, but then you still get to keep the equipment. Potentially put that on a flyer or something maybe with first strike. And yeah, we saw cards that care about equipment, and I think that +2/+0 type of stat boost could be useful. Attached to certain creatures, like I said. So I'm gonna give this like 6 in like the right deck, in a deck that cares about having equipment. It could be efficient, but a lot of the times just okay. Alright, so next we have Awaken the Sleeper, which is 3 in a red for a sorcery. Oh, we're on to the uncommons, by the way. And it says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn. And if it's equipped, you may destroy all equipment attached to that creature. So, kind of a bummer that you don't get to maybe attack with the equipped creature and then destroy the equipment. So that's a bummer, but you could destroy the equipment attached. But anyways, probably the main reason you're taking this is to gain control of a creature until end of turn. Of course, that's a very aggressive thing to do because it's card disadvantage. At the end of the turn, you don't really have any value you've gained from this other than the amount of damage it's able to help you deal to the opponent's face. And, that is useful in its own right, especially in a very aggressive deck. And potentially you could even gain control of the creature, attack, and then sacrifice it to something, which is sort of the ideal way to use a card like this, because you get the attack, you get the blocker out of the way, and you ultimately kill the creature, so that ends up being not card disadvantage anymore. So there's some potential for this card. The problem is it's very situational. Plenty of times I'm just not going to be happy to see this card in my hand. So I'm going to give it a 5. I think that's where effects like this tend to end up for me. Alright, next we have Cacophony Scamp, which is a red mana for a 1/1 creature Phyrexian Goblin Warrior. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it, and if you do, proliferate. And when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So whenever you see an effect that's like dealing damage equal to power, it makes sense to try and buff this up, maybe with equipments or auras, but probably equipments. And yeah, like if you put that +2/+0 on this and it dies and deals 3 damage to something, that's pretty good value. If it just dies as a 1/1, it might not really be able to do anything. Maybe it could shoot, some kind of X1, 2/1, 3/1, 4/1, something. The first ability, being able to sacrifice and proliferate, seems pretty useless to me. It's really hard to get in with a 1/1 because it's just so blockable. And you have to sacrifice it also. And in the early game, like the only time when I really see this being able to hit very easily, you're not going to have much to proliferate. You're not going to have many creatures with oil counters or anything. It's like that ability just seems pretty bad to me. The only real benefit of this card is getting that damage when it dies, and that's just, you have to do some setup. I would just rather play something a bit more consistent, so I'm going to give this a 4. But I think you could use this card to decent effect in the right deck. Alright, next we have Churning Reservoir, which is a red mana for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on another target non-token artifact creature or... Sorry. Put an oil counter on another target non-token artifact or creature you control. You can pay 2 and tap to create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token, but you can only activate that if an oil counter was removed from a permanent you control this turn, or a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into a graveyard this turn. So it puts one oil counter on your creatures each turn, and you can pay 2 to get a 1/1 as long as you've used oil-based abilities or had an oil creature die. So, I mean, this seems good. I mean, it's powering up all your oil creatures, of which there are many. You get that token generation, which is, I think, a pretty, if you keep activating that turn after turn, you have some way to turn that board into value, maybe like a board pump if you're playing white or something like that. Then I would say this is pretty good. I think in an oil deck, you're actually really going to want this, and like, it's actually an interesting build around that I think is kind of exciting. Like, all the oil abilities and all the colors, depending on what other color you're playing, like, this could do a whole lot just for 1 mana. You just drop it on turn 1, probably had nothing else to do, and now all of your oil stuff is just that much better. So, like, I'm going to give this an 8. I'm excited to play with this. This seems really fun and good. We'll see. Alright, next we have Exuberant Fuseling, which is a red mana for a 0/1 creature Phyrexian Goblin Warrior with Trample, and it gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it. And when it enters the battlefield, and whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on this. So, enters with 1 oil counter, so it enters as a 1/1 for 1. And when creatures, so if you sacrifice stuff, it gets another oil counter, so it just grows and grows and grows. In a sacrifice deck, I mean, this seems great. I mean, often in draft, you skip that turn 1 because, you get bad cards like Cacophony Scamp. But you could, on occasion get actually good 1-drops, and it's very worth it. And this one can grow pretty decently. I mean, if you're activating all those synergies, this could get pretty big for 1 mana. So yeah, I'll give it a 7. I think in a really aggressive deck that has this game plan, has other ways to maybe put oil counters on it, it's great. I mean, you just get a lot of stats for that 1 mana. Alright, next we have 2 in a red for a 3/3 creature Phyrexian Warrior with Menace, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, this deals 2 damage to that player unless they control 2 or more basic lands. So, obviously in Limited, they're always going to have 2 or more basic lands, almost certainly. So, that ability irrelevant, but we have a 3/3 Menace for 3, and those are good stats. I mean, in red, you normally don't even expect to get a 3/3 for 3, and like, the Menace is extra. It's good. I mean, stats are good. You want to play this. Yeah, 7. I'd say it's great. Alright, so next we have Gleeful Demolition, which is a red mana for a sorcery, which says destroy target artifact. If you controlled that artifact, create 3/1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. So yeah, I mean, this is very similar to an old card called Kolbotha Rebirth, which is really good in Pauper, I think, and which was basically just the sacrifice an artifact and you get 3 goblins part. But this also, it hits their artifacts for just 1 mana. And this is an artifact format, so that type of cheap artifact destruction feels like exactly what you want. Definitely think this is good, and if you're a sacrifice deck, getting all those goblins definitely could be helpful. Sacrifice a skull bomb just to do it. So yeah, I mean, this is great. Definitely want this in most red decks, if not all. All right, next we have Hex Gold Halberd, which is 1 in a red for an artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. And as long as it's your turn, equipped creature gets first strike and has trample. So, enters as a 2/2 first strike trample for 2. Already, that's good stats. Wins against most stuff that costs the same amount. And, you know, it doesn't give any stats, so like that equip cost feels pretty steep, but still. Oh, and it's only when it's your turn it has this ability, so it's a very aggressive card, but it still doesn't also doesn't give stats. I think the main reason you're playing this is just for the 2/2 you get at first, which is pretty good. Like I'll give it a 6 just because of that. The equipment itself feels pretty clunky to me. It doesn't really do enough. I want some kind of stat boost, even if those abilities could be useful in the right situation on a really high-powered creature, for example. So I guess there is that utility of like turning a high-powered creature into a much bigger threat. But you need to build your deck accordingly. Maybe I'll give it the 0.5 just for the potential there. Alright, next we have Magmatic Sprinter, which is 2 in a red for a 3/2 creature Phyrexian warrior with haste. When it enters the battlefield, put 2 oil counters on target artifact or creature you control. At the beginning of your end step, return this to its owner's hand unless you remove 2 oil counters from it. Okay, this is interesting. So when it enters, you could put 2 oil counters on it. Haste swing, deal 3, and then you basically could pay 2 oil counters to keep it. Otherwise, you have to return it to your hand. That could be good. Maybe you're dumping oil counters on something else. The 3/2 haste would be good. I mean, I think that would be good stats in red. Maybe even a little bit above average. Since you don't get to keep it and it's draining your oil, I think stats-wise it's quite a bit worse than just that. But as an engine card, where this is just dumping so many oil counters on things, I mean, that's pretty nice if you don't have anything else you need to spend the mana on. And like in the right deck, I think that could be great. I mean, there's very few cards that actually generate that much oil that I've seen. So it's exciting in a way. It's sort of a strange card, but just because I feel like it's bad for your tempo, like the oil counters just aren't doing that much, but and you've had to pay the 3 mana, you don't even get to keep the creature. It's like not great tempo, but I think the value is definitely there. And if you can protect yourself and not die, this is a lot better. I'll give it. So hard to rate. This is a really interesting card. I'm gonna say 6. I'll say 6.5. All right, next we have Nahiri's Sacrifice, which is 1 in a red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature with mana value X, and it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures. So I kind of don't like this card. I like sacrificing artifacts and creatures in this set because there's a lot of cheap little ones to sacrifice, but this doesn't work with cards like that. Like, you're not getting much out of this if you're sacrificing a Might or, you know, a Goblin. Actually, you're getting nothing because they have no mana value. So you need to actually be playing out like bigger artifacts or creatures and then sacrificing them. So you're like losing out on a pretty big asset. Like if you're actually dealing a lot of damage, you're losing out on a big asset. Still, if you have creatures that give you some value when they die, it actually could be good. And yeah, thinking about it, like there's lots of little creatures like recent when I was looking through the black cards, like you could sacrifice a Testament Bearer, deal 4 damage divided as you choose, and you're still, picking one of the next three cards. That's definitely value. I mean, you could probably kill one or two or three creatures with that. So arguably, that's kind of a blowout. It's tough. I mean, I think in the perfect deck where you've got lots of creatures with death abilities and you don't really mind if they die, maybe you're gaining something from it, it could be good. I'm just gonna put out 5. But I feel like if you want this, you would know it. Is how I feel. All right. So next we have Oxidative Finisher, which is a 5/5 and a red for a 7/5 creature ogre rebel with affinity for equipment and trample. So I mean, this is interesting. If you actually like manage to build your curve out of those 4 Mirrodin equipments, this could be pretty spicy. I mean, the dream, or like what it would take to actually make this card like very good, is to have 3 equipments out by turn 4. Okay, that's pretty unreasonable. And then play this as a 4 mana 7/5. Yeah, that wouldn't happen. Maybe you could play it on turn 5 as a 7/5, and that would be pretty good. I mean, it's huge, it's tramply, but it's also not the hugest. And you need so many equipments to actually reduce the cost into a good range. Like if this costs 6, I'm not getting too excited about that. Although it's still alright at that point. Who knows, maybe that's even a little bit good. It's just a lot of damage. But if you're paying the full 7, I don't think that's worth it. So obviously you're going to want equipments in your deck. And ultimately, just a big creature. But the trample is nice. Gotta admit, the trample's nice on that huge power. So I do want to say this is like a 6 or a 7. I'm going to say 6.5. Next, we've got Rebel Salvo, which is 2 in red for an instant affinity for equipment, and it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible until end of turn. Okay, so first off, 2 in a red to deal 5 damage at instant, and it goes through indestructible. I mean, that's excellent. I mean, already, you don't even have to reduce the cost with that affinity for equipment. That's a great removal spell. Just a lot of damage for the cost. I mean, that makes this automatically like really powerful removal. I'm gonna give it 8.5. Kills just about anything. Almost always for cheaper than the creature cost. If you actually have equipment in your deck, it's like 1 mana, kill anything. I mean, that's such a good card. So, yeah, love it. All right, next we have Resistance Skywarden, which is 3 red for a 5/5 creature ogre rebel with menace and reach. That's it. I mean, I think the stats are good. You've got the 5/5 for 5. I mean, that's the classic vanilla test. Like, honestly, pretty big for red. Menace, huge. They can't just chump block it. If you swing it at them, they've got a dilemma. And reach just means, their flyers don't matter, or unless they have a lot of them, they're not going to want to attack into your 5/5. That's great for you. So it just stabilizes the board. So huge, so chunky. Your opponent probably doesn't have anything bigger, but, never know, but they probably don't. And it's a good aggressive threat. I mean, only good things to say. I'll give it a 7. All right, so next we've got Urabrask's Anointer, which is 3 in a red for a 4/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian Wizard. When it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to any target Rexes the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. So, obviously a good enabler for oil decks. I think it's not going to be too hard to have at least 1 or 2 out, and that's enough to probably kill a creature. So it's a 2 for 1. In an oil deck, you're 100% going to want this kind of a lot, so I'm just going to give it an 8. I mean, It's an 8, assuming you have the pieces in the deck that it clearly is meant to go into. But it should be achievable, I think. Alright, so now we're on to the rares. We've got Dragonwing Glider for 3 red red, and it's an artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. And equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has flying and haste. And it's also equipped 3 red red. So it enters as a 4/4 flying haste for 5 mana. That's definitely some like stats you'll only see at rare. Um, it's just very cheap and aggressive, and your opponent's going to deal with that immediately. It's a bomb basically, and so I'm going to give it a 9 just for that. I mean, those stats are so good, so scary. And the fact that it can just move the equipment on to something else, who knows, maybe you get like a 6/6 or 7/7 flyer out of that and just smack your opponent. There's very little they can do. Seems amazing. Definitely want this in every red deck. Alright, so we've got another rare Planeswalker, which is... Are they starting to do this now? Like, this wasn't usually a thing they did, except for, in War of the Spark, where they had so many Planeswalkers, but... Anyways, the card is Koth, Fire of Resistance, which is 2 red red for legendary Planeswalker, Koth. It starts with 4 loyalty, and the +2 is search your library for a basic mountain card, reveal it, put into your hand, and shuffle. Okay, I mean, the fact that it's a +2 is great. I mean, it's harder to kill Planeswalkers when they're upping with a +2 ability, and it just helps you hit your land drops for all your other cards, so, that's always nice. -3, Koth deals damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains you control. So the more red skewed you are, the more powerful this is going to be, but even in just like your average half and half deck, like, this should still be able to do 2 or 3 damage pretty easily. And, that could kill a thing, and you still probably have this around. And it could help protect you from the creatures that are still a threat to this when you play it. It's always good to have an ability like that on a Planeswalker. And the -7 is you get an emblem with whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target. Okay, so that is a good emblem. You'll probably trigger it 1 or 2, maybe 3 times. Killing multiple things. The +2 helps you find more ammo. So, there's a couple things. You could use this as removal, or you could use it as sort of a late game, you sort of locked the game down, and you just need some sort of win condition. And, getting that emblem, you can just start potentially just shooting at your opponent's face if they're low enough, or killing whatever threat they have. The emblem is pretty easy to get to. I mean, that's a turn 3 -7 you can get. So it's pretty interesting. It's tough to say. I mean, I think I would give this at least an 8. Just because, I don't know, it might be better. I'm gonna... Just because the -3 deals damage to a number of mountains and you're probably not mono red, that's why I'm thinking it's not too like top tier bomb. I still would usually pick this and play this happily in any red deck, but we'll just have to see how good it is. Alright, next we have Red Sun's Twilight, which is X red red for a sorcery. Destroy up to X target artifacts. If X is 5 or more, for each artifact destroyed this way, create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So, in an artifact format, I mean, being able to just blow up X artifacts is pretty good. I mean, there's still... Most things are not artifacts, we've got to be honest about it. But there's still a lot of them. And let me just read this for a sec to try and figure out if you need all... Okay, up to X targets. So yeah, you can just put X up to 5, even if you don't have X, targets, and get a copy of them for the turn, and they gain haste and whatever. So yeah, you basically could steal their board of artifacts, attack them with it if it's artifact creatures. Um, Maybe sacrifice them if they're skull bombs, if they don't just sacrifice it in response. Uh, I mean, I think it's got to be pretty good. The only thing is like a lot of the time you're going to be the thing that's really a problem for you is like a creature, and it might not be an artifact creature. It probably isn't an artifact creature. So like this isn't like the most flexible removal ever, but it's going to have lots of targets, and it could completely obliterate your opponent's board, depending on how all in on like the artifact sub theme they are. So I wouldn't say it's anything crazy. Sorry. I mean, it's quite good. I should be clear, but there are better things. Alright, so next we have Rook Hexcold Nabber, which is 2 and a red for a 2/2 legendary creature Goblin Rebel with Trample and Haste. And whenever an equipped creature you control other than Rook Hexcold Nabber attacks or dies, you may attach all equipment attached to that creature to Rook. This is a very strange creature. 2/2 Trample Haste for 3. That's kind of small. And the ability to, when it attacks, or when the equipped creature attacks, you could steal the equipment. It's just weird because why are you attacking with a creature if it's going to lose all the equipment? It's going to be way worse in that combat if you move them onto this. It's weird. Like, why doesn't it have like first strike or something? This is just, I don't like it. I'm like, it's a rare. I'm like trying to figure out what's so good about it. But I just feel like it's not that good. Potentially, you just kind of like you swing in your 4 Mirrodin creature and it dies and goes on to Rook cheaply or for free. And then, that saves you some tempo. It's all right. But the base stats are just so small. And like if things aren't lining up the way you want it to, I just don't see this being that good. I'm just gonna give it like I'm just gonna go down. I think this is like a 4. I don't really know what the idea is with this. Alright, so next we have Slow Bad Iron Goblin, which is 2 in a red for a 3/3 legendary creature Phyrexian Goblin Artificer. And you can tap and sacrifice an artifact to add an amount of red mana equal to the sacrifice artifact's mana value, and spend this mana only to cast other artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. So again, we have the problem of like you want to sacrifice something expensive to try and play something else, get a lot of mana, but like, inherently, if you're playing an expensive artifact, it's hopefully a pretty good artifact, and I don't think you're going to want to sacrifice it just to get some mana. That's just really bad value. I feel like this is more of a constructed card or like a commander card where you could abuse that. You could sacrifice like I forget the name of that card, but like sacrifice it, take an extra turn, gain 5 mana now, or like even just sacrifice a thing, draw a card. Like that's not something I've seen too much of. I can't remember if there's something like that in this format. Um, but yeah, I don't love that ability. Probably am not gonna want to activate it, except in really niche scenarios. So, I mean, I'm grading this, I guess, as a 3/3 for 3, which, honestly, in red, that's fine. So I'll give it a 5. Next, we have Urabrask's Forge, which is 2 in a red for an artifact. After the beginning of combat on your turn, put an oil counter on this, and you create an X1 red Phyrexian Horror creature token with Trample and Haste, where X is the number of oil counters on the Forge, and you sacrifice that token at the next end step. So yeah, I mean, this continuously gives you bigger and bigger X1s to swing in. Like if you get this on turn 3, by the end of the game, you're probably swinging in with at least like 4 power, 5 power, 6 power. It could go much higher if you're just doing a good job of keeping alive. And eventually it's going to become something your opponent just can't really deal with. They can't block that. Blocking barely helps because of the trample. And yeah, I mean, you play this, I think, unless you just top deck it and you're like about to die, this eventually grows into a pretty big threat. Doesn't help you at all on defense though. So I'll just give it an 8, but I think I would love to have it. Alright, so next we have Vindictive Flamestoker, which is a red mana for a 1/2 creature Phyrexian Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. You pay 6 in red to sacrifice it to discard your hand and draw 4. And this costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on this. It's definitely interesting. 1/2 for 1 is bad. Doesn't really do anything on the board, but I don't think that's why you're playing this. You're probably playing this to try and draw 4 cards. And of course, the only way you're actually drawing 4 cards is if your hand is empty. So you don't want to play too bogged down of a mana curve. But ultimately, that's the only reason to play this, and often it's going to take a while for you to empty your hand. So it's like a late game card draw card, but it eventually gets very cheap if it sticks around when you're casting on creature spells. It's tough. I mean, it could be a lot of card advantage. Just because it takes a lot of work, I'll give it a 7.5. I mean, I still think that's a high rating, but yeah, I mean, drawing 4 cards. I love that text. But takes some work. Thankfully, you don't need to put any oil counters on it to actually activate the ability. So yeah, it's kind of no pressure there. Alright, on to the mythics. We have All Will Be One, which is 3 red for an enchantment. And whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. So yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, the biggest problem it has is it's 5 mana, doesn't affect the board immediately. So, I mean, if you're going to die that turn, obviously this is not the play. You have to have something else to stabilize you. It's kind of just like your Warstorm Surge or something like that, where you're going to need other creatures to or other things to stabilize you. Hopefully your opponent isn't going too crazy at that point. But if you afterwards start playing out your oil creatures, they deal damage equal to the oil counters you get things, and if you have a lot of oil creatures, I mean, you're going to be just blasting every creature dead. So, you know, that's a huge upside, just completely destroying everything. But you also need a deck that's built a lot around it. It's tough. I don't think this is like the bomb territory, but there's a lot of potential. I think you stick this and then you play all your oil creatures, and also just if you're also playing Infect, although red doesn't seem to be very... It's like red is the only color, I think, that doesn't have Toxic. Am I right about that? I don't think there's a single Toxic creature. So yeah, probably oil counters. Still a good card. Alright, so now we have Capricious Hellraiser, which is 3 red for a 4/4 creature Phyrexian Dragon. It costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. It also has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. And you can choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Very strange card. At worst, it's a, 6 mana 4/4 flying, which is decent. Definitely kind of a win condition. The other abilities are tough, though. I mean, you're probably not getting 9 or more cards in your graveyard very easily, so it's probably full price. And you exile 3 cards at random, so like there's a high chance you don't get anything because it's also very specific about what you can actually cast. Just a non-creature on land, which most things will be one of those. Uh, it's like kind of both of the abilities I feel like I should just ignore because they're just too random and like too useless in limited. So I'm just gonna grade this as a 4/4 flying, which is like a 6 to me. Alright, so next we have Sulfim Mayhem Dominus, which is 2 red red for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. It's a 5/4, and it says if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And you can pay 1 Phyrexian Red, and discard 2 cards to put an indestructible counter on Sulfim. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, 4 mana 5/4, that's good. Being able to give it indestructible counter, you know, even if you have to pay some mana and some life and discard 2 cards, which that's a big cost, you can give it indestructible. Sometimes a big indestructible is enough to win because a lot of the time your opponent's just not going to have any way to deal with that. Like if you're playing against red or black, I would feel pretty comfortable, or even green, I'd feel pretty comfortable putting those indestructible counters. If you're playing against blue or white, I'd be careful because they could bounce your creature or they could enchant it. And if you've already discarded the 2 cards, you kind of just lose out on a ton of value by activating that. So be careful. That ability is super powerful. If you have lots of ways to ping the opponent or deal the opponent damage, or it also works on the creatures. So yeah, it's gonna make all of your burn, even creature-based burn, more effective. And you can't complain about that. I mean, that's great. I'm gonna give this like an 8. I would give it higher if I thought there was like a lot of ways to damage your opponent directly, and there's a few. I'm just not the biggest fan of them, I guess. Uh, but still, it turns, your 3 damage any target spell into like 6 damage to the face, which certainly, if you have a few of those, it's going to add up. Opponent can die pretty quickly if you just like got in a little bit of creature damage. Maybe this must be higher. I mean, I guess I would get more excited about that than like just a good removal spell. So yeah, I'll give that a 9. And with that, that is every red card in Phyrexia. All will be 1. And yeah, let me know which of these cards you're excited to play with. All will be 1 is a card I've been playing in my Super Friends deck on Arena, and it's pretty funny because, I mean, every Planeswalker you play, you just deals like 6 damage to something or 6 damage to their face, and every time you plus your Planeswalkers, it's dealing more damage to stuff, and it's a lot of fun. So yeah, see you all next time. I hope you enjoyed.